We're going to be talking about an incredibly thorny issue, and that is the World Athletics Federation's policies on transgendered athletes in athletics.
The Council has agreed to exclude male to female transgender athletes who have been through male puberty from female world ranking competitions. It must be guided by our overarching principle, which is to protect the female category.
I've been doing athletics for a number of years, so this is something that's kind of more topical in that sphere. The issue of transgender athletes in world athletics is a complex and sensitive one. On one hand, there is a need to ensure that all athletes are able to compete fairly. And in this video, we will not be talking about people like Caster Semenya, who's a hermaphrodite, or women who have fantastically high testosterone level, although they are incredibly linked to this subject. And this boils down to one overriding concept, and that's the concept of fairness. On one hand, there is a need to ensure that all athletes are able to compete fairly and on a level playing field. On the other hand, there is recognition that transgender athletes face significant barriers in participating in sports, and their inclusion is important for promoting equality and social justice. But should this come at the expense of female athletics and sport? The ideas and concepts of fairness date back to the very early days of competitive sport, although it was primarily meant to be fairness in terms of promoting yourself as the gentleman, to enhance the concept and ideas of the gentleman athlete.
We've always believed that our games are indispensable in helping to complete the education of an Englishman.
Perhaps, sir, you would rather I played the gentleman and lost.
To playing the tradesman, yes.
Important to note, the concept of fairness in sport is a complicated one in itself, and opinions can differ depending on specific circumstances and perspectives. On one hand, sport can provide a level playing field, where individuals compete based on their skill, hard work and dedication, without regard to other factors such as race, gender or socio-economic status. In this sense, sport is considered fair, as each athlete has an equal opportunity to succeed based upon ability alone and effort. But if you've watched any form of Olympic sport, you will notice that, and it can be argued that sport is innately unfair. If we were to utilise the previous concept, Usain Bolt's 100-metre races wouldn't be 100-metre races, there'd be a short dash with him running 120 metres and the slowest athlete in the race running 80.
There is something of a myth of fairness in sport. Sport has never been fair. You bought into that myth, so have a lot of other people. But let's face it, nature endows her gifts unevenly in society. Be a jockey, I couldn't be a basketball player. You might make the cut in basketball. You're what, 6'1", something like that. So you might just about make it, but you'd still be a small guy on the NBA circuit.
It also fails to recognise that, on one hand, external factors such as access to resources and training, discrimination and unfair rules or regulations can create inequalities in sport, leading to unfair outcomes. If you have more money promote into a sport, you're more likely to get more medals if it's well placed. For example, some athletes may have access to better facilities, equipment and coaching, which can give them an unfair advantage over other athletes that lack those resources. And we find in early sport that training, believe it or not, was considered performance enhancing and therefore banned. Britain banned the most amount of athletes for training, and even some suggested that eating a diet that helped with performance should be banned. As you can imagine, this was very hard to enact. World Athletics, like many other Olympic governing bodies, has been faced with a moral dilemma that many of the founders of their sports never really understood or could foresee potentially happening. And that's people transitioning from one sex to another sex and wanting to compete at an elite level. From here on in, we're going to be talking about the term gender and sex in terms of how science defines it, not how it's used in society, in order to help you guys understand the concept we're talking about later on in this video. Sex refers to the biology, whilst gender refers to sociological traits that you consider to be either male or female. So, to use an example, sexually, this is a male or a female, based upon biology.
Now, I realize how badly you want out of the Army, but it's my considered opinion that no one's going to believe that you're pregnant.
Gender-wise, this is a man in a dress.
What's all the hoo-ha? You crazy? You wrecked a $39 dress.
Now, outside of science, it doesn't matter. The term gets used to get used so frequently together, it's like trying to define the difference between jealousy and envy.
Okay, he's here. Let's have it. What's wrong with Klinger?
Now, you do not need to be Sherlock Holmes or have a sports science degree to realise that someone who was a man and now is becoming a woman is going to have a greater advantage competitively, potentially, than an actual fully born woman.
How do you know about them? Elementary, my dear Watson.
Transgendered men were more accepted into the sport as compared to transgendered women. And this is due to a number of factors. Firstly, men produce more testosterone than women. Yes, you did hear that right. Women also produce testosterone, just at very low levels. Testosterone is used for muscle repair and growth. However, it would be too simplistic just to talk about testosterone. There are other factors that make them potentially have a greater advantage. If you've been through male puberty, your bone density is likely to be stronger, taller, have longer limbs, which can be beneficial in most athletic events, and have a greater natural propensity for testosterone. You're more likely to use it more efficiently and effectively. So, pretty conclusive, right? We should not allow transgendered athletes to compete. Well, maybe not. According to a lot of the research, there is an increasing debate, disagreement as to whether this is actually the case, whether they are actually superior in terms of stat. This is mainly because we haven't seen an elite transgendered woman actually win anything yet. That is the key word in that term, yet. Those who partake in elite sport are a small number of people. Those who do well at elite sport are even less. We're talking about sometimes 2 to 4% of any athletic population will make it to a World Champs or Olympic Games or even compete internationally. Many of these elite athletes are genetically freaks of nature, and as a result, with such small numbers of people being able to make it to elite level and having transgender people at such small, even smaller numbers, those entering elite sport are going to be even smaller. Originally, World Athletics tried to create regulations limiting testosterone. They set an arbitrary value of 5 nanometers per litre of testosterone to prevent potentially hyperandrogenic athletes from participating and athletes transgendered from competing in order to make the events fairer. Now, what blew this completely out of the water? Discovery of women who were hyperandrogenic, who were born a woman, who lived happily healthy lives as a woman, yet still being high in testosterone. Not everyone reacts the same with testosterone. Some women are naturally born with higher amounts of testosterone, and what you find in track and field athletics, athletes generally have a higher testosterone level than the baseline population. What this indicated and did not take into account was that in certain populations, say for instance South Africa, for some reason, regardless of race, people generally have higher levels of testosterone level in the wider populace. So without taking these demographics into account, we just stuck an arbitrary value that wasn't necessarily reflective of the athletes we had in our system. Now, many of these athletes, the reason why they have high testosterone levels might be because, well, they're doping. Possibly. Later on, this regulation changed from 5 nanomoles per litre of blood testosterone down to 2.5. And in certain events there was a higher percentage on certain androgenic hormones. In 2021, the IOC came up with a guidelines and framework in including transgendered athletes into elite sport. Currently, the guidelines are that transgendered women must undergo hormone therapy for at least 12 months prior to competition in order to reduce their testosterone levels to below the threshold of 10 nanomoles per litre of blood. Transgendered men are not subject to the same restrictions. However, in a guiding framework, more of a case of, in order for us, the IOC, to meet promises to protect human rights and inclusion and diversity, you, the governing bodies, you come up with the rules. As a result, not all sports organisations follow the guidelines recommended by the IOC, and there is an ongoing debate about whether they are sufficient in ensuring fair competition. This is something that can only be really debated sport per sport. Some argue that the physical advantages of male-born athletes, even after undergoing hormone therapy, give them an unfair advantage over female-born athletes if they have gone through puberty. Likewise, there's also been a debate about the actual research itself. The research the IOC endorsed was fully completed around 2015-2016, but by 2018 there had become debates about whether it actually still was accurate. It is worth noting that many athletes, as well as academics such as Lindsay Sharp, 800-meter GB runner, are highly critical about the rules as they stand prior to 2023. It's worth noting that these arguments made on both sides are not necessarily universally accepted, and there are also arguments in favour of transgender athletes competing in elite female track and field as it in a way of promoting inclusivity and challenging gender norms, as well as respecting the autonomy and dignity of transgendered athletes. Ultimately, however, it's up to the sports organisation and governing bodies to develop policies and guidelines that balance the interest of fairness, safety and inclusivity, as well as allowing women who are born women to compete competitively. And that is what exactly happened. Another key argument focuses on the past in women's athletics. Women were generally regarded as not being able to do sport, or should not be able to do sport, and the reason being was because of an old notion that somehow they'll be damaging their bodies and not being able to get pregnant, which is disastrous. This also played up against the gentleman's social norms of what should be happening in society and what was morally acceptable in the early 20th century and the late Victorian period.
Amid great controversy, it was decided to allow women to compete in track and field for the first time. Fears were expressed that athletic competition could physically damage the weaker sex. The only track events they were allowed to compete in were the 100 metres, the 4x100 metre relay and the 800 metres.
Nowadays, with that medical science, we know that's complete utter nonsense. And athletics was one of the sports that was probably the most inclusive. It's one of the most inclusive sports in terms of race and gender as well. This did not, however, come so easy. It came as a struggle and a fight to allow women to do exactly the same as what the men are doing in track and field athletics. Putting it into a modern day concept, many athletes train all their life from children and dream of winning Olympic gold medals and world championships from a very young age. To have that potentially taken away from you because someone who was born a man then decides to compete in the female competition, this is from a Lindsay Sharp perspective, can be incredibly disheartening. It takes great effort, training and a challenge to be able to compete at an elite level. Very few are able to do it. Very few still are able to be successful at it. And what Lindsay Sharp was referring to was what is the point when someone can compete against her who has what she would conclude an unfair advantage. Ultimately, the issue of transgendered athletes in world athletics is one that requires careful consideration of the rights and needs of all athletes involved, both the cis-born female athletes as well as the transgendered athletes. It is important to continue to have open and honest discussions about the best ways to ensure fair and inclusive competition for everyone. Now, as I said earlier, I would discuss my opinion is that women should be able to compete fairly and know that the competition they are running against is fair. Likewise, on the other hand, if you are a transgendered athlete, you deserve that right to compete. You deserve a right to compete, and that you deserve a right to be respected as an individual and as a human being. But this cannot come at the expense of being an unfair advantage if you were to compete in a female sport. Now, many sports have debated how they could potentially allow transgender athletes in, and one of these are having what we call an open category, having the men or the men's category as an open category. Likewise, there is no simple answer as to whether what is right or what is wrong. And guys, I want to know in the comment section, what are your opinions on World Athletics' new policy on transgendered athletes? Now, likewise guys, we do like debates on this channel, but we also like respect. You respect the person's opinion, providing that it's not offensive, and that we tackle the concept of their ideas and the content of their ideas, not the character. I'm Adam McCarthy, this is Immersive Sports Science, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.